The process of assessment of any kind of learning is actually a pretty simple, rather straightforward process. We tend to want to know where kids start, we want to know where they end up, and we want to keep track of their progress along the way. This part of the teacher work sample, the assessment plan, is the plan that you will put together to ensure that students are learning and to keep track of it and to be able to prove that what you taught is what was learned and that yours was the main influence in their instruction. The idea of assessment in general is, as I said, very simple. We will look at the post-test achievement data. We'll subtract from that the pre-test achievement data, and the resulting number that we get, or the result that we get, is called an achievement gain. Now, we do use assessment for a variety of reasons. We use it for, in this case, we're looking to judge the effectiveness of our instruction, and we're also looking to judge the effectiveness of students' learning. So here's the basic process. If you look below the red line, first, you will be devising a pre-test that is going to be correlated to your learning goals. It is going to be the same instrument that you will use for your post-test. So you will truly do a single instrument, pre and post assessment of your students' learning. And then within the lessons themselves, there are 5 lessons that will be taught with the teacher work sample. And within those 5 lessons, within each lesson, you will have formative assessments that will allow you to know where the students are as they're progressing from one lesson to the next, and so on. Generally speaking, if we pre-test students before we have taught them anything, and then we teach them, and then we post-test them, we can believe that the results of the post-test, or the difference between the pre-test and the post-test, that achievement gain that we get, is due to our teaching. And this was one of the main criticisms of teachers in the late 1980s and on into the 1990s, where we were not really a data-driven profession. I've mentioned before that we were not even considered a profession by some. We were considered a craft because the way that we went about doing the things that we did was so unscientific and so completely unsupported by data that it wasn't justifiable. It really was just a sort of an art example. So, this is where we are with the big picture. Now, as we turn to the teacher work sample, the first thing we're going to think about is going to be the pretest. Remember that, and you can see this in both of these, both the graph on the right and the tabular information on the left, which is a microcosmic look at a grade book. There are 4 students there, 2 boys and 2 girls, and what we've done is administered this pretest, including all 4 learning goals. And note that this is not a typical grade book looking table, because this is only one test. But what has happened here is the test itself has items on it that represent learning goal 1, learning goal 2, learning goal 3, and learning goal 4. And those are being reported separately here. The importance of this is that if you remember in the learning goals section, we talked about taking standards or taking whatever content it is that you're required to do and breaking that down into some more discrete parts. A learning goal might represent less than the complete verbiage or the complete idea, the content in one standard. It might also represent the entire standard. But I want you to notice what we did here. If you look at boys 1 and 2 and girls 1 and 2 and look at their data, as you look across, you can begin to draw some conclusions just in your own mind about where they did well, where they did poorly, and perhaps the things just numerically, even though you don't know where they or what this content was or what the mistakes were that they made, you can see that if we're looking at percentages on the left, which we are, take for instance Girl 1. Girl 1 on the Learning Goal 1 got 16%. Not very good, but this is a pretest. We're not too worried about that. Girl 1 on Learning Goal 2 also got 16%, which is not out of line with the other scores, really. And we follow that over to Learning Goal 3. Girl 1 on Learning Goal 3, 6%. Look at the difference just numerically. We're looking at the left side now. Look at the difference between the achievement on the pretest on Learning Goals 1, 2, and 3 when compared with Learning Goal 4. The information that this pretest has given us is great, because what we now have is we have a sense for which content the students actually already have. If we look at the learning goal graph on the right-hand side, we see that learning goals 1, 2, and 3 all show pretty low averages, pretty low achievement. Learning goal 4, however, shows tremendous achievement. These students have already, on average, attained a 76.25%. Graphically, we see that the distance between the top of the bar in the graph and 100% is really what we would be thinking about in terms of what we want to teach. So, the assessment plan must be devised so that it includes all of the necessary elements, that is, all of the learning goals, and it needs to also make sure that all the data are gathered and kept, anything that's going to be important. Now, some people may say, well, don't you need to put your lesson plans together prior to putting your assessment plan in place? The answer is no, and that's one of the problems we have when we teach. So many times we start out teaching without having a firm idea of what the end ought to be. If we establish an assessment plan, we clearly establish what the end ought to be. Consider if you were going to take a trip in your car. You would not likely get in the car, start it up, and begin driving, and then decide where you wanted to go. This is a similar situation. Now, remembering that everything for the assessment plan builds from the learning goals, and it is based on the implications of the contextual factors section, you can format the information in your report exactly as is shown here. You can use a table, which is what is shown here. This is fine. Or you can use a complete narrative. The benefit to the table is if you use the table as it's shown here, you are guaranteeing that you have covered all of the material or all of the aspects that you need to. Arranging things in a tabular form is a good way to address multi-point prompts. Remember that this section has to include the actual instrument that you will administer as your pre and post test. There are two important points that have just been made. First, your pre-test is your post-test, so it is one document that you will give 2 times. And the second point is that has to be finished and submitted in the assessment plan portion of the teacher work sample prior to doing any instruction. Again, the last point there is that this document must be arranged by learning goals. So think strategically. Think in terms of, for instance, if you have 4 learning goals and you have a 20-item pre-test / post-test, then perhaps you would have 5 items for each of the learning goals. As you're doing all of this, if you have more or less, if you have to vary those numbers somewhat, that's okay, but do try to make sure that you have adequate representation of all of the parts of each of your learning goal on your pre and post test. If you make that pre and post test very carefully, it will drive your instruction and it will save you a great deal of time in your teaching. Now, as we move on, this is an example from an actual teacher work sample. It's a lesson or from a plan, assessment plan. And the points here are, note that the learning goal is spelled out in its entirety. All the verbiage is there. The assessments, pre-assessment, formative assessments, and the post-assessment are all described. And note that there are adaptations. Any adaptations that will be necessary need to be noted here. Because, experimentally speaking, any adaptation is a change, and any change can affect your data. So you need to show at the outset what you're going to do and how that is tied back to your contextual factors. Yes, we're trying to gather good data, but more importantly, we're trying to serve students, and we need to take into consideration all of the individual characteristics that they bring to the table.